Ben Bernanke may be 100% confident that he can control any coming inflation, but our next guest is equally sure that inflation is about to get out of control in the United States. Joining us from San Francisco is John Williams. He is an economist for shadowstats.com. John, thanks for joining us. I have to tell you, I've been reading your reports here, and I feel the distinct need to start building a bomb shelter and hoarding canned goods. I mean, you really don't pull any punches here. You call for nothing less than the Great Collapse. Can you tell us what that is and what it looks like?
Well, eventually it's going to be a hyperinflationary Great Depression in the United States. I'm not looking for a hyperinflation in Canada. The hyperinflation in the United States is due to really decades of extraordinary fiscal abuse. If you look at the government's financial statements on a generally accepted accounting principle basis, what you'll see is that the annual deficit is running $4 to $5 trillion a year. That includes the year-to-year change in the net present value of the unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare. Putting that in perspective, a $5 trillion deficit can't be covered by taxes. The government could take 100% of everyone's income, corporate profits, they'd still be in deficit. They could also cut every penny of government spending except for Medicare and Social Security, and they'd be in deficit. Those programs have to be reduced. There's no political will in Washington to do so. You just saw the response to the president's deficit commission, which primarily was aimed at the cash-based deficit, getting that down to around the reported $200 billion that they've had in recent years. It's not really addressing the gap-based deficit, which is the one that ultimately has us bankrupt. Because over time, unable to raise the taxes, most governments, they don't default on their debt. What they do is they rev up the printing presses and create the money to pay off the obligations. That would have doomed us to a hyperinflation by the end of this decade. But then the crisis of the last couple of years has brought in the problem much closer. We've seen extraordinary actions taken to prevent the system from collapsing. With the Fed, with the U.S. Treasury creating and spending whatever money they had to do to keep the banking system from collapsing, to keeping the financial system from collapsing.
Okay.
It's held things stable, but the economy's still turning down. The solvency crisis is getting worse. The Fed is already into quantitative easing too, and we're beginning to see the effect of inflation from that. And that will eventually evolve into a hyperinflation.
Okay, well, just to counter that a little bit, I mean, because I know people make references to, Weimar Germany and the hyperinflation of that time, but there's also been, debt doesn't necessarily make for hyperinflation. A lot of people have been concerned that where the United States is going is really to more of a Japan-style lost decade, where you have huge debt, but just no growth and deflation.
The Japan circumstance was never aimed at debasing the U.S. dollar. Mr. Bernanke is very openly trying to debase the dollar, and he's met with some success. We're seeing the dollar near its historic lows. It hasn't pushed to new lows yet. When you see that, when you see panic selling of the U.S. dollar, that's when you have to be very careful. But what's already been done with the dollar has spiked oil prices. We're seeing that now in higher gasoline prices in the United States. Commodity prices are up 20-30% year to year in dollar terms. That's largely a function of Mr. Bernanke's monetary policy, not due to surging demand in oil prices or such, or oil demand.
But John, the last time we saw inflation getting out of control in the United States, somebody stepped in. His name was Paul Volcker. He prescribed some tough medicine, and he got inflation under control. So isn't there a bit of a precedent here, a history showing that, when the cards are on the table there, Americans are willing to make these tough calls?
Well, that was 3 decades ago. We generally had a much smaller trade deficit. We were in a position that we could have contained the budget deficit. The fiscal condition at that time of action had been taken. I'll contend it's too late to do it now. Again, the draconian measures are just politically unacceptable to what you saw a general rejection of what this commission in Washington was proposing.
But do you not feel, though, I mean, when I look at, at kind of what you're proposing is going to happen, and you say sometime maybe within the next year or within the next 5 years, is this not a little too catastrophic?
It is catastrophic. I wish it were not. I'm really an optimist at heart. I'm not selling anything here. I've only been physically assaulted once for my outlook here. Is a very nice lady at a bank directors meeting threw a jelly donut at me. She had a pretty good arm and she hit me. And her point was, where's the good news here? The good news is that from a personal perspective, there's action you can take to protect yourself.
Okay, well, John, let's go into that. What are the concrete steps that you think people should be undertaking, both as investors, but maybe as simply as survivors in some kind of future financial apocalypse?
Well, in terms of the maintaining the purchasing power of your assets and wealth, and this is primarily a problem for people who live in a U.S. dollar-denominated world. Canada is not going to necessarily have this problem. You look to put your dollars in hard assets like physical gold and silver, getting the dollar into other currencies such as the Canadian dollar, Australian dollar, Swiss franc. In the U.S., we don't have a backup system. Zimbabwe, you mentioned earlier, had the worst hyperinflation anyone's ever seen. But they survived. They had an ongoing economy. That was because of a black market in U.S. dollars. But we don't have a black market in the U.S. There's no backup to our system, which gets very difficult when food starts to disappear from store shelves. What happens? I mean, you can use common sense, but it's probably a good idea to store goods that you would normally consume for several months, just to protect yourself, your family, and to have goods for barter.
Okay, so you're actually describing basically a third world hyperinflation scenario. I just want to come back on that though and ask you. I mean, a lot of people see a weakening of the U.S. dollar, at least in the near term, is actually potentially good for the U.S. and for the U.S. economy. And we've actually seen on the export side, for example, U.S. exporters are just roaring on all cylinders. They're exporting to all the BRICS countries and seem to be, undergirding some kind of recovery there. Do you not hold out any hope of that being a positive and helping to pull the U.S. out of any kind of potential threat here?
Since 1970, against the stronger currencies, the dollar's lost 80% of its value. And at the same time, we've seen an explosion to having the world's worst trade deficit. Aside from commodity products, the pricing is not as key as most people think. I used to be an importer myself. There are many things that importers and exporters can do to maintain their market shares. The problem here is that the weakness in the dollar will also be reflected in higher inflation. So as the dollar drops in value, and maybe that gives you an edge on the markets, you're going to see inflation here, and the goods of the products that are going to be exported are going to be higher priced, so that you lose the edge with the dollar. This is not good news. Weakness in the dollar is what will kill the system here. It's what will trigger the early signs of a hyperinflation, which, as you mentioned, could be as early as the next 6 to 9 months. Down the road, that remains to be seen as to the timing, but watch the dollar, watch for a panic there. If it gets out of control, you'll see massive dumping of dollars. The Fed will be intervening even more than it is now. People are going to be turning over dollars as quickly as they can. They're not going to want to hold them. Prices will skyrocket. We're going to see this in the next couple of months, starting with gasoline and food prices.
Okay, John. Well, all I can say is we hope you're not right, but we really appreciate talking to you today.
I hope I'm not right, but it doesn't hurt to take a little insurance. And I'm afraid I am right, though. Thank you for having me.
Okay, well, thanks for your time. Our guest has been John Williams. He's an economist with shadowstats.com.